Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Saturday everybody. I hope you're having a restful weekend. Yesterday I experimented with a new editor, a third party. I very much appreciate everyone's feedback. It was good to have that feedback and to get a sense of what you guys prefer. We'll go back to regular editing now. Over the coming weeks and months, I'm going to experiment with different third-party editors, and hopefully we can find one that is the right fit for the channel and which you all enjoy as well. So thank you very much for the feedback. This will be a transition that will happen over the next several months, and especially once the channel gets to a level of financial stability that would allow for hiring someone to help with the editing. Okay, let's begin with today's episode, and we begin by moving through a few salient miscellany related to the Chinese economy. This week, China is on vacation for their 5-day Labor Day break. As such, it seems like a good time to be examining tourism spending in the country, which acts as a good proxy for consumer confidence, something which we and Beijing policy makers have been following very closely. Tourism spending, especially international tourism spending, has lagged behind pre-pandemic levels for years. This year had some promise. Lunar New Year saw absolute spending past 2019 levels for the first time, but spending per person still lagged. US-based Bloomberg Intelligence argues that now Chinese tourists are headed overseas for the extended May Labor Day holiday at pre-pandemic levels, quote, accelerating a rebound of what used to be the world's biggest travel market. End quote. Outbound trips between April 27th through May the 5th, which includes the 5-day break that started on Wednesday of this week, are now just only 7% below 2019 levels, according to Forward Keys. Meanwhile, domestic ticketing has surpassed 2019 levels by 4% for the period. The data, along with the results of Bloomberg Intelligence's China Traveller Sentiment Survey, showed demand rebounding, quote, despite concerns the country's sluggish economy is weighing on consumer confidence and spending. A swift return of Chinese travelers who spent almost $248 billion on trips abroad in 2019 before the pandemic essentially shut down tourism, a key to finding a big hole in the global travel industry. End quote. Tim Backus, Bloomberg Intelligence's senior industry analyst, expressed on the findings, quote, we are now well ahead of the pace, that's the bottom line. We are seeing an acceleration and an increase of expectations on China's outbound travel. It's recovering faster than what the industry expected at the beginning of the year. End quote. According to World Travel and Tourism Council data, in 2019, Chinese travelers made 170 million trips abroad, and their spending made up 14% of global tourism revenue. Bloomberg Intelligence expects international air travel from the mainland to top 90% of 2019 levels by year-end, after a strong first quarter. This is good news from Beijing's perspective, but again, we note that these rates are still below pre-pandemic levels. As we can see from these Bloomberg Intelligence numbers too, destinations in Asia, including Malaysia, Singapore and Indonesia, are set to become the biggest beneficiaries of the jump in Chinese travelers. A much weaker yen is also pulling Chinese vacationers to favor Japan. Chinese visitors ranked third among international arrivals in March, though their numbers are still about 35% below pre-COVID levels. Bookings for Italy rose 19% from 2019 levels, while the UK is seeing a 12% gain. Australia, the United Arab Emirates, the UK, Italy, New Zealand, Turkey, Qatar and Egypt are among the destinations whose flight capacities with China surpassed levels before the pandemic. The return of China's travellers has long been awaited in the travel industry, of course, which is expected to surpass pre-pandemic levels this year by contributing $11.1 trillion to the global economy. That's the global travel industry, not just Chinese travellers. With restricted flights and geopolitical tensions, though, the US travel industry is lagging behind. But Chinese consumer sentiment has improved. In 2021, 87% said they considered the US an unsafe tourist destination. In March, March, this has dropped dramatically down to 36%, voicing the same concern. Next up, we turn from the international to China's domestic market. Chinese financial media outlet Yicai reports that transportation authorities in the megacities of Shenzhen and Chongqing are the latest ones to have issued warnings about the saturation and fierce competition in local ride-hailing industries since last year. Shenzhen's Transport Bureau of the Shenzhen municipality warned enterprises and individuals who intend to start related businesses to, quote, assess the actual potential income and make prudent choices, end quote. Chongqing's Municipal Transportation Bureau similarly expressed in a risk alert this week that in the first quarter of the year, about 65,000 vehicles received monthly ride-hailing orders in Chongqing, equal to 55% of the city's total ride-hailing fleet. Quote, given the order size, it is difficult for the total 118,000 ride-hailing cars to remain operational, as their number has far exceeded the demand, end quote. Of course, this is great for consumers, but very tough for the workforce, often made up of migrant workers in the informal services labour force. Anecdotally, my 20-minute ride to work in the morning using the app Didi, similar to Uber, normally costs approximately $3, and drivers often tell me that the industry has become so difficult that they're required to spend 12 to 14 hours a day in order to earn enough to live on. Ride-hailing vehicles in Ningbo of wealthy Zhejiang province received an average of 16 orders a day last year, logging an average daily revenue of just $50. This is a huge industry in China too, according to data from the online ride-hailing regulatory information interaction platform. Some 891 million online ride-hailing orders were placed in China in March, up 15% from February. As of March 31st, China had issued 6.8 million online ride-hailing driver licenses and 2.8 million online ride-hailing vehicle licenses, up 30% and 27% respectively from a year earlier. Yicai writes that many ride-hailing drivers say that their income has also declined. Quote, in the past, a driver could earn between 60 and 70 yuan, $8 to $10 for a 30-kilometer ride, but now that price has dropped to about 50 yuan. One Guangdong-based driver told the outlet that over the past year his working day had increased by 2 to 3 hours, while his income per day had declined 35%. Why is this happening? Well, it's a double hit. More low-skilled workers leaving the building sector into this driving industry, combined with fewer orders from customers as consumption continues to suffer from weakness. Both of these, of course, are bad signs for the health of the national economy. Next up, we move to China's US treasuries and financial conflict debate. If you're getting some value from today's episode, as always, I have a big favor to ask. That is just to like and subscribe. It's 2 clicks to the mouse, but it's a huge help for me and the channel in order to grow. Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are also in the description below. I rely primarily on your support to keep going financially. The hope is one day I can do this as my job and hire people to make the channel bigger and to improve the viewing experience. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, in a recent issue of Contemporary International Relations, the Journal of State think tank, the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, Di Dongsheng, Vice Dean of Renmin University School of International Studies, published a piece highly critical of China's investment in US government bonds, sparking policy debate in the country. Di argues that this investment is fraught with risks, sees poor returns and other vulnerabilities, all of which should motivate Beijing to unwind its holdings further and avoid being held hostage by Washington, writing, quote, there's no reason to load up on US treasuries. We have seen how Washington treated Russia's overseas assets, as well as what happened to German and Japanese assets during World War I and World War II, end quote. Such comments do cause eyebrows to rise, however. They do suggest that the author anticipates war between China and the US. Of course, regular viewers know that since the war in Ukraine, Beijing has sought to reduce its reliance on the US-led global financial infrastructure. and become more self-sufficient. These sort of articles from such high-ranking policy influencers suggest that these preparations continue to be advocated. Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post, reporting on all of this, writes that believes that the prevalence of US treasuries and the US dollar as a medium of international exchange exemplify the country's so-called exorbitant privilege, quote, creating an entrenched global dominance that allows Washington to binge on debt and make gains at the expense of others, end quote. He argues that as the world's largest manufacturing power, it's easier to reduce its holdings, and perhaps Beijing is way ahead of him. The South China Morning Post reports that the PRC has been steadily dumping US Treasury bills while diversifying its foreign assets, offloading $22.7 billion in February alone. Total holdings were $775 billion at the end of that month, according to the US Treasury Department, a far cry from the all-time high of $1.316 trillion in November of 2013. Quote, that reduction is occurring as bilateral ties wane, with the two superpowers engaged in parallel struggles over trade and tech, and the West taking steps to disentangle itself from China's economy. Beijing has also grown wary of the US weaponizing its financial power and is making its own pivot to reduce exposure, end quote. He argued that treasuries too were a poor investment, with other assets promising far better returns. Like I said, this article has sparked debate in China, with one of the best critiques coming from one of our old friends. Quote, an awful lot of prominent people still don't understand how the balance of payments works. The Vice Dean of Renmin University School of International Studies, for example, has called for China to continue reducing its USD holdings. In fact, China isn't reducing its holdings of USD assets. It is increasing them. The People's Bank of China may be selling part of its direct holdings of US government bonds, but Beijing overall continues to increase its holdings of USD governments, agencies, and other assets. It has no choice. It runs the largest trade surplus in the world. And while its current account surplus is much smaller, there is strong reason to believe that the current account includes flows that would more correctly show up in the capital account. That means it is acquiring a huge amount of foreign assets, and with the US running by far the world's largest current account deficit, China has little choice but to acquire dollar assets, especially given its increasing reluctance to hold developing country assets. It is worth considering what would happen if China really did try to diversify out of the dollar. The most obvious way, of course, is for China to stop acquiring foreign assets. That just means for it to eliminate its trade surplus. China's large trade surplus, however, is the flip side of its very weak domestic demand. And so until it embarks on a major restructuring of its economy, China cannot reduce its trade surplus without a sharp contraction in GDP growth. Alternatively, China can shift out of US dollars and into euros and Japanese yen. Of course, this means that the US deficit would contract as the dollar gradually weakened, to be replaced by a switch in Europe and Japan from surpluses to deficits. That would cause consternation and anger in Europe and Japan, as they too suffer from relatively weak domestic demand, and the consequences for their economies would be weaker manufacturing and slower growth. What many people still don't understand, even those who should know better, is that the so-called exorbitant privilege is a privilege that only the US and the UK seem to be willing to accept, and even then, I hope, not for much longer. End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Saturday, have a lovely weekend, and I will see you all on Monday.